into the hearts of their enemies.
Tears in the stomach or intestine.
Waffen SS were fierce fighters, extremely loyal. They didn't believe in loss or surrender.
Put UC in check and keep it there.
Weponology travels back into the dark heart of the most feared military organization in history.
Help you save.
When the Allied troops run up against the SS units, they knew they were in for a fight. They could get really nasty.
They were Adolf Hitler's Dark Knights, the Waffen SS. It's time to go ballistic. The Waffen SS were Adolf Hitler's elite fighting force. They were the most ruthless and feared soldiers on the battlefields of World War II.
You had a group of folks who were very, very tough, ideologically motivated. You can't admire them, but you certainly had to respect them.
The SS, or Schutzstaffel, German for personal bodyguard, became a vast political army, but were originally set up to protect Adolf Hitler. The Waffen SS, meaning armed in German, were the deadly combat arm of this larger organization. This group didn't just protect, they also went on the offensive. When regular German infantry units turned and ran, Hitler would order in the Waffen SS. They would grow to a vast army of nearly 1 million men. Backed up by tanks, artillery, and the best weapons of World War II, their elite division struck rapier-like during the Battle of the Bulge and fought to the very death in Russia.
Waffen SS revolutionized the way that battles were fought. They were the elite fighting units of the world.
The dark side of this vast army was well known. Their fanaticism fueled the bitter hatred and horror of the Holocaust, forever linking the name SS with racial hatred and hideous war crimes.
The Waffen SS was intimately bound up with the whole concentration camp system, and there's no real way that you can separate the two groups.
Hitler's henchmen would become notorious for their cold-hearted ability to kill on and off the battlefield. The Waffen SS soldier was a die-hard fighting machine. At his side, the ceremonial dagger, a symbol of loyalty until death. His sidearm was a design classic, the deadly Luger pistol. Ready to fire was a Sturmgewehr, the first assault rifle ever, a killing technology so advanced that its influence is still evident on today's battlefields. These iconic weapons, and others like the Tiger tank and MG-42 machine gun, would be years ahead of their time, shaping the combat zone of the future. Yet, back at their beginning, Hitler's bully boys used the most basic weapons available. Now, Weponology will go back through generations of technology to unlock the Waffen SS's family tree. The men, the machines, the moments that shape the history of this elite fighting unit. Rewind to 1929, when the SS armed themselves with clubs and knuckle dusters. Over 200 members of the SS would become the muscle behind a man who would soon plunge the entire world into a dark abyss. Adolf Hitler.
The Nazi Party had a bunch of street toughs. These were the bully boys, and they were out to beat up on the communists and socialists and other folks.
They were street thugs. They were, at that point in time, in the very beginning, so fiercely loyal to Hitler and carrying out just about any order that he would possibly give.
By 1934, the SA, or Sturmabteilung, German for Storm Division, had grown to become the SS's main rivals in the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler decided to wipe out this threat to his political success and ordered SS assassins to kill over 80 people on the night of the Long Knives.
The night of the long knives, basically the SS went out and killed the hierarchy of the SA, and then the SS takes over as the elite of the Nazi Party.
By 1940, the Waffen SS had set itself up as the military arm of Hitler's new elite, headed up by the Fuhrer's second-in-command, Heinrich Himmler. To join their elite divisions, recruits had to be physically fit, committed to the Nazi cause, and pass Himmler's tough laws on racial purity.
There were very, very strict racial criteria. You had to be at least 5'10" tall. You had no defective teeth. You weren't allowed to be a spectacle wearer, and you had to be able to prove your Aryan ancestry back to 1750.
These guys were thought of as sort of the vanguard of the Nazi Party, and to get in was a really hard thing to do.
Rewind to World War I. The Germans used heavily armed shock troops called stormtroopers. They hoped these small, fast-moving elite units would blast their way through the Allied lines and end the bloody stalemate of trench warfare.
These were small groups of men armed with light weapons, the early submachine guns, grenades, spades, bayonets, anything that they could use for close combat, hand-to-hand fighting.
The German stormtroopers would use a revolutionary new weapon, one of the first submachine guns ever invented, the MP-18.
This is a milestone in weaponry. It's a fully automatic submachine gun. Because it's so short, so small, you could maneuver this around in a trench very, very easily. And this weapon was the way to generate lots and lots and lots of firepower.
The MP-18 would take the lethal firepower of the early German machine guns, like the Maxim, and marry it to the portability of the rifle. Weighing in at just over 9 pounds and firing over 400 rounds per minute, the MP-18 was a small but deadly package.
As a trench sweeper, this is very, very, very good.
To complement the increased firepower of the early submachine guns, 2 World War I stormtroopers, Felix Steiner and Paul Hauser, would come up with tactics that would shape SS training.
Both of them were World War I veterans who saw the agony of the trench warfare in the First World War, and they knew of the upcoming Second World War that the battlefield would have to be much more fluid.
Steiner and Hauser's new ideas would train the Waffen SS to become a more mobile strike force that could infiltrate and break down enemy positions. 1 out of 3 candidates would fail the tough training regime.
They were trained in full military training, which was extremely rigorous and hard, and that was to weed out those that could not call themselves Waffen SS. Much like our Marine Corps training, it's to get rid of the dead wood, people that cannot hack it.
For the first time, every man trained together, from the officer right down to the buck private.
In combat, men don't fight for God, motherhood, apple pie, the flag, the Fuhrer. In combat, men fight for each other. And because these units were very cohesive, they proved to be a very formidable unit on the battlefield.
The Waffen SS were on top of their game, and when it came to weapons, ahead of their time. By World War II, they would fight with a revolutionary new type of gun. It would change the face of the global battlefield. It was the world's first assault rifle. Hitler would christen it the Sturmgewehr.
It's the first widely fielded intermediate caliber assault rifle. Essentially a weapon that blended the use of a standard service rifle with a submachine gun.
To trace the family tree of the Sturmgewehr, we travel back to the MP-18. The designer of this early submachine gun was Hugo Schmeisser. Schmeisser would later go on to realize the deadly potential of combining the firepower of a submachine gun with the more accurate bullet of an automatic rifle. The end product of his genius? The Sturmgewehr.
Gotta do buzz switch, baby.
This amazing weapon could fire over 500 rounds per minute and was accurate to over 400 yards. But more importantly, it could be carried by just one soldier onto the battlefield.
Is that enough, or you want to do some more?
This assault rifle would change the face of combat over the next 60 years.
This particular weapon is the granddaddy of the AK and the M16 and all the assault rifles that are in service around the world. In my opinion, the most significant small arm fielded in the 20th century.
But the Sturmgewehr had a bigger, badder brother. It would be described by American wartime intelligence as the most remarkable gun of its type ever developed. In the hands of the Waffen SS, it will become a rapid-fire reaper.
And a propaganda thing that they used was they said, its bark is worse than its bite. Well, the fact of the matter is, its bite was 10 times worse than its bark.
The battlefields of World War II were a maelstrom of metal and death. The Waffen SS were armed with some of the best weapons of the time and an iron will to never retreat. By the end of 1942, the war had started to drain Germany of many men and materials. The Waffen SS needed a new machine gun that was cheaper and faster to make. German weaponologists would design one of the deadliest weapons of World War II, the MG-42.
It's a very deadly weapon. It has a very, very high rate of fire, about 1,200 rounds a minute, rather than the 600 to 800 which characterized most machine guns of the time. And that's going to make a mess of you.
Nearly 500,000 MG-42s would be mass-produced. Made of sheet steel and molded plastics, it took half the amount of time to make than its predecessor, the MG-34.
The weapon I have here is a German MG Maschinengewehr 42. The MG-34 is all machine, extremely time-consuming. MG-42 is sheet metal rolled, stamped, and welded.
The MG-42 fired over 1,200 rounds a minute. When this weapon unleashed its lead, the results were devastating.
This is a man target at 400 meters, and that person is down. Having that firepower is incredibly comforting. The only person that would not be comforted by having the MG-42 was the opposition.
In Normandy, during the summer of 1944, MG-42s would unleash a tsunami of death against the advancing British troops. Their weapons were still fed by magazines and would come up dangerously short against the MG-42, which produced the highest rate of fire of any single-barreled light machine gun ever. The noise of this new killing machine would send shockwaves of fear amongst those who were unlucky enough to face it.
When it goes off, it sounds like a big piece of canvas being ripped. It's a psychological effect.
As soon as we heard that gun fire, we knew it was a German machine gun. And you respected it, because they could really pump out the lead with it.
The weapon would soon earn a new nickname, Hitler's buzzsaw.
The cyclical rate was so high you could barely hear the report between the rounds. That's why they nicknamed it the buzzsaw.
The U.S. Army tried to beat back the fear factor of this deadly weapon.
Here's the new MG-42. The German gun shoots fast. But if you know your stuff, you can stop them cold. Remember, their bark is worse than their bite.
One of the things that they did to the soldiers, which was, in hindsight, probably not a smart move, but a morale thing and a propaganda thing that they used, was they said, its bark is worse than its bite. Well, the fact of the matter is, its bite was 10 times worse than its bark.
The MG-42 gave the Waffen SS an unmatched ability to keep their enemy pinned down. So squad tactics were redesigned around its deadly rate of fire.
The entire squad movement was centered around the MG-42. The whole idea of the infantrymen was to be able to advance that machine gun so that they could overtake and overwhelm their objective.
SS units were laying down some serious heavy metal. Their philosophy? Rapid fire, rapid death. No surprise then that even their sidearms followed this deadly tradition. In 1908, a design classic would first come into service. It would become a firm favorite with the SS, the 9mm Luger pistol.
There it is, the infamous Luger pistol. The Luger is like a Swiss watch. Each of the parts are marked with the last 2 digits of the serial number. This is because the pieces are individually fitted to the weapon. Tolerances are tight. Accuracy is excellent.
The Luger was stylish, iconic, and very desirable.
It's very accurate, it's very well made, but above all, it's super sexy. It looks the part, and it's very easy and nice to shoot.
The Luger's angled handle was designed to make this pistol a straightforward, straight shooter.
It has a nice angle on the handle here, and the design was to be able to point this at a target with your eyes closed, and then when you open your eyes, you should be lined up with your target. The reason for that is it has a perfect flow from your hand to the sights. Where you point this pistol, it will hit. 8 well-placed shots to somebody's chest, I think the game is over.
The Luger was very accurate, but its precision German engineering proved unpredictable in the blood and filth of the battlefield.
Its sensitivity to dirt was recognized by the German military. It was addressed not by changing the design of the gun, but by changing the holster. The military-issue P08 holster is a glove that fits around the gun with a tight-fitting cover, completely protecting it from mud, dirt, and rain. When it was done, you drew the gun out, took the safety off, and you had one of the fastest-firing, best-handling military handguns used in the world.
As the Allies crashed through Europe, the Luger became the best war souvenir you could get your hands on.
It was a very prized weapon amongst Allied troops.
But very quickly, they learned not to pick them up.
If you were caught with this weapon,
the German military would shoot prisoners who were caught with a German Luger.
It was a fate that must have crossed the mind of Moffett Burris, a 24-year-old captain with the 82nd Airborne Division. In April 1945, as the Allies neared victory in Berlin, Moffett was given orders to stay put. But the young captain decided to jump in a jeep to see just what lay ahead of his division. Unfortunately, he stumbled into the German army.
We drove about 40 miles, about halfway to Berlin, and ran head-to-head into a German armored corps. Just hundreds of tanks and half-tracks and trucks and probably 15,000 or so troops.
Moffett needed a plan, quickly.
I got out and went to the lead vehicle, which had a German captain in it, spoke English. I said, "I'm here to accept your surrender." He looked back and said, "Are you crazy? 3 men in a Jeep?" I said, "I have a whole army of paratroopers and tanks right behind me, and the Russians right behind you. You want to surrender to us or them?" He said, "Wait a minute." He called a conference of about 3 or 4 officers, came back and walked up to me and pulled his pistol out. And I thought to myself, oh no, I'm out here in the last few days of the war. Then he turned it around and handed it to me.
Moffett and his 2-man army had somehow managed to secure the surrender of an entire German Panzer Corps, and he'd be taking home a fine war souvenir.
So I was the proud possessor of a Luger that was owned by a German lieutenant general. I brought it home, and one of my kids lost it. I was ready to shoot him.
The deadly handheld weapons of the SS helped create their Nazi hardman image. But it was the tanks that sealed their reputation. Weaponology is about to feel the roar of the Tiger. The battles of World War II had been defined by the Goliaths of steel, the tank. The Waffen SS had one beast that would strike fear into all Allied soldiers. Get ready to batten down the hatches and feel the roar of the Tiger. Rewind to the 20th of April, 1942. The first prototype of the Tiger tank is presented to Adolf Hitler as a birthday present from the German people. It could not have come at a better time for the Waffen SS. They just had a rude awakening on the Eastern Front.
The SS thought of themselves as supermen. They were better than anyone else. They looked better than anyone else. They were the good guys. They ran up against the Russians, and the first shock to them was that the Russians had a better tank than they had, the T-34.
Up until that point, Germany's panzer divisions had utilized light and medium tanks to devastating effect during their Blitzkrieg or Lightning War. But Adolf Hitler became obsessed with the idea of a big tank with heavy armor and a killer gun. He would work with his top designers to come up with the Tiger, a 60-ton monster armed with the awesome 88mm gun. The 88mm gun had originally seen service as an anti-aircraft weapon. It was designed to blast a 20-pound shell 30,000 feet into the air and annihilate heavy bombers. Then, the Germans discovered it was even more deadly against the armor of tanks.
What you need in an anti-aircraft weapon is very high velocity, long barrel, so that the trajectory of the round is more or less flat. As they discover, if you pointed at a tank and fired this high velocity round, it would go straight through most tank armor.
The Tiger and its killer bite would be rushed into action for the assault on Leningrad in August 1942, spreading dread among the Allies. The fear factor was about to go through the roof.
Listen to this. Reports Oberst attached Henschel boasted of new tank which would win the war. Armor twice as thick as existing tanks, it could travel underwater, and he wouldn't be surprised if it could even fly.
Pretty well ahead with it, too.
One of its principal roles in military operations is what's called shock action. This idea that suddenly tons and tons of metal comes storming through a position and you can't do anything about it. That introduced a lot of fear in Allied soldiers. Now, if you've ever heard tanks manoeuvring, particularly at night, it is terrifying. You've got hugely powerful engines for a start, which they sound like aircraft warming up on the ground. You've got all the metal tracks clanking around. They're firing their weapons, they make a hell of a noise as well. And quite rightly, people are terrified of them.
The boots on the ground especially feared this new SS super tank. Moffat Burris saw the devastating effect of the Tiger's 88mm gun when his buddy was vaporized by one.
The Tiger tank was back behind us firing. I was wearing a raincoat. I stepped on the raincoat and tripped, and just as I did, an 88 shell went right where my head was. The man that was in front of me just blew him apart.
The American paratroopers hit back with whatever they could get their hands on. But the shells just bounced off. Now it was time for the Tiger to strike back.
And I could see the gun, the Tiger tank, wheel around. And it hit that gun, just blew it apart, killed them, dumped them right in front of us. And that's a little disconcerting when you see that.
Across Europe, the Tiger and the hands of the SS would reign supreme.
This thing it's huge, it's very heavily armored, it has a great gun. If you ran across a Tiger, well, gee, that would ruin your day.
The Tiger would often face off against the American Sherman tank. The Sherman was the main tank of the Allied Army, but it was much smaller, lighter, and fielded a less powerful main gun. The Tiger's 88mm could penetrate the Sherman's 3-inch armor at over a mile, well beyond the effective killing range of the Sherman's much lighter gun.
The 88mm gun could turn an M4 Sherman tank into a hunk of molten metal very, very quickly.
The Tiger's killing prowess was coupled with deadly tactics from Waffen SS tank aces. One such commander would go down in history, Michael Wittmann.
Wittmann had been a member of the Waffen SS since the late 30s. He'd risen through the ranks and become an officer. Through the Russian campaign, he had demonstrated he was the great Tiger tank ace of the Second World War.
In June 1944, Wittmann would inflict hell on a British convoy in the Normandy village of Villers-Bocage.
He was an amazing tanker, feared and respected by his adversaries.
He utilized his favorite tactic of hitting the lead and the rear vehicle, understanding that if you can't go forward and you can't go backwards, everybody in between is caught in a fire trap.
The Waffen SS ace was credited with destroying 27 tanks in just one day. Wittmann became a legend.
I think just the most extraordinary tank-to-tank action that was fought in the Second World War.
In the hands of the Waffen SS, the Tiger would rule. The Tiger was the ultimate marriage of fast-evolving tank technologies and the deadly firepower of the 88mm gun. But this battlefield big cat was simply too costly and difficult to produce. Just over 1,300 Tiger tanks were built in World War II, in comparison to over 57,000 Russian T-34s.
Because the Germans didn't have a lot of them at any one place at any one time, it wasn't a war winner.
The Waffen SS couldn't rely on the Tiger. They simply couldn't make enough of them. As the war raged on, they'd have to go back to basics, back to their origins, back to cold, hard steel.
You're holding it like a hatchet and you're coming straight at somebody. They were done.
The Waffen SS was one of the 20th century's most formidable and evil elite forces. Armed with cutting-edge weaponry, Adolf Hitler would assign his best divisions to almost impossible missions. They would be tested to their absolute limits when Hitler ordered the invasion of Russia in 1941.
The fighting on the Eastern Front was a knockdown, drag-out fight. The SS didn't take prisoners. Russians didn't take SS prisoners either, so it could get really nasty.
The political indoctrination of the SS gave them an unfaltering belief in the Nazi cause. They simply believed they were unbeatable, especially against the Russians, who they saw as racially inferior.
The indoctrination received by the Waffen SS in their basic training made the word retreat disappear from the SS vocabulary. They fought to the last man, to the last round.
This was what was expected of Hitler's henchmen. When they completed their training, the soldiers of the Waffen SS were presented with a ceremonial dagger. It represented their sworn loyalty to their Fuhrer.
This is an SS honor dagger. The inscription on this is "Mein Ehr ist true," which is "My honor is my loyalty," which was the motto of the Waffen SS.
The SS Dagger was covered in ancient symbols like the swastika.
Well, Hitler was very much into symbolism. A lot of mysticism and occult involved in it. Black Knights, Blackguard, everything was put there to strike fear into the enemy and pride in the Greater German Reich.
During the early years of the war, regular German army units looked down on the SS. They weren't battle-hardened. They weren't feared. They weren't respected.
The German army had a very poor opinion of the SS. The SS was a political force. They were policemen. They just weren't soldiers. They had to earn respect.
The SS would soon earn a fearsome reputation.
In the beginning, the SS didn't fare very well in battle, but as their skills were polished, trial by fire, they became extremely effective, and later were the ones that in multiple battles held the lines open to pull out the entire army groups.
Fast forward to July 1943. In the battle for the Russian city of Kursk, the heavily armed, highly mobile SS Panzer Corps attacked with tanks. But Stalin's Red Army had prepared a deadly defense around Kursk, including over 500,000 anti-tank mines. With the German tanks sidelined, the Waffen SS's abilities in hand-to-hand combat were put to use.
This is your basic K98 bayonet. In trench attacks or close quarter attacks, it was extremely effective. You thrust and twist. This was very devastating, especially if it wasn't sharpened. You couldn't repair the tears, whereas a sharpened blade would make a very clean cut, easy to repair, easy to save the soldier.
In a no-holds-barred battle, even the most basic infantryman's tools were used as lethal weapons.
This is your standard entrenching tool. You have a longer reach than a bayonet. It is much heavier. It can do a lot more damage. You're holding it like a hatchet and you're coming straight at somebody, you could cave anybody's head in with one shot. You hit somebody with one of those, they were done.
The savage fighting around Kursk would end in a Russian victory. But the Waffen SS were now firmly established as a fearful adversary. In September 1944, the Allies would launch a vast airborne attack into occupied Holland, codenamed Operation Market Garden. Two SS divisions would defend the town of Arnhem. Many of these troops were armed with a rapid-firing submachine gun that was ideal for street-to-street combat. Its name, the Schmeiser, or MP-40.
This is an original MP-40, or machine pistol, 1940. Before World War II, the Germans developed a number of machine guns, or submachine guns, a pistol caliber like this. By 1940, they were producing a weapon like this that was very efficient, fairly light, and could be stamped out of sheet metal and using the first plastic used in weapons.
The MP-40 was incorrectly nicknamed the Schmeiser, after the famous German weaponologist Hugo Schmeiser, designer of the MP-18 and Sturmgewehr assault rifle.
The weapon got its nickname as Schmeiser, and Allied troops would capture them, and on the magazine, because Schmeiser owned a manufacturing company, he stamped his name on the magazine. But in actuality, he had nothing to do with the design of the gun. When the Allies found the guns, they'd see Schmeiser on the magazine. Henceforth, they nicknamed it a Schmeiser.
The Schmeiser was actually designed by a German weaponologist called Heinrich Vollmer. The weapon was fed by a standard stick magazine holding 32 rounds and could fire 500 9mm bullets a minute.
Clear.
During the battle for Arnhem, the British airborne troops were armed with the Schmeiser's counterpart, a mass-produced stamped metal submachine gun called the Sten. But how did they compare?
Clear. Well, this target tells us that the Sten is not very accurate. With the Sten, you only count 3 arm shots, so you have a wounded soldier who's going to come back and fight another day. The MP40, I was aiming the gun the very same way. This target is actually a little further away from where we were standing, so a bit more accurate gun.
The Waffen SS and their MP40 would rule the streets of Arnhem. It would be a crucial weapon that would blast the British paratroopers into submission and secure a vital German victory. Despite their triumph at Arnhem, the war was beginning to turn against Germany. The Nazis' industrial war machine was being pulverized by Allied bombing. Under relentless pressure to turn the tide of the war, Hitler's weaponologists would develop some of the best and worst weapons of the 20th century.
When it was evaluated in the United States after the Second World War, it was sort of like, what are these guys thinking about?
December 1944. The Waffen SS would spearhead Hitler's last throw of the dice, the Battle of the Bulge. Personally selected by their Führer, Hitler's henchmen would use weapons and tactics that were both brilliant and desperate. A new bolder, badder, and bigger brother of the Tiger tank would rumble through the blood and guts of the combat zone. The 70-ton King Tiger.
The King Tiger was a desperation weapon of all intents and purposes. It was probably the heaviest tank that has ever fielded for battle.
It mounted a longer 88mm gun than the Tiger I, thus giving it greater range, greater penetration against armored vehicles.
As well as a killer gun, Hitler's heavyweight was virtually indestructible. No Allied round would ever pierce its frontal armor. That's no surprise when you realize it's a shell-defying 7 inches thick. Just under 500 of these 70-ton monsters would be made. With that amount of heavy metal, something had to give.
The problem with the King Tiger is they up-armored it so much that if the Tiger I was mechanically unreliable, the Tiger II was twice as mechanically unreliable.
For a vehicle of that size, with all the armor that it mounted, the very heavy turret, you need to have colossal engines to power them up, and it simply didn't have that.
In the thin Belgian roads that made up the killing fields of the Battle of the Bulge, the King Tiger's crown would fall, crash, and burn.
It wasn't suitable for use in that environment because the roads weren't wide enough. It lacked the mobility, it lacked the speed to keep up the rate of advance that the Germans needed. So it was simply the wrong vehicle to use.
The Battle of the Bulge would end in catastrophic defeat for the Germans. It also marked the end of the road for the Waffen SS's King Tiger.
When it was evaluated in the United States after the Second World War, it was sort of like, what are these guys thinking about?
It turned out to be an evolutionary blind alley in tank design because it lacked the key element, mobility, in the holy trinity of mobility, firepower and protection, which is what you want in a good tank. So the modern main battle tank, the American Abrams tank, the British Challenger, they're more derived from the lighter German tanks like the Panther.
With desperation fueling the German war machine, Nazi designers would develop some of the best and worst weapons of the 20th century. One new idea was a real curveball. Attached to the Sturmgewehr assault rifle, the Krummlauf, or curved barrel system, was originally designed to fire from within the safety of a tank turret.
The way this is used tactically was to open the hatch and stick this out the hatch of the vehicle and then literally hose the vehicle down from inside the vehicle. That way you stayed under armor and kept them off.
The Krummlauf's barrel bent at an angle of 30 degrees. It seemed to solve the age-old problem of how to blow your enemy to pieces while remaining safely under cover. But the metal barrel and the bullet itself were put under enormous pressure as the weapon was fired. German designers experimented with vent holes drilled into the barrel to allow the release of built-up gases as the bullet slowed to make the turn. This reduced recoil and stress on the weapon as it was fired. Despite these modifications, the Krummlauf would wear out after just 300 rounds. It was destined to become a weaponological dead end.
The question always comes up, does this work? And the answer is, yes, it does, but if you're in my crew, you're going to get it, and let me know where you're going to fire it, because I want to be under the Kevlar blanket in the back of the vehicle.
While some weapons designed for the Waffen SS, like the Krumlauf, were technological blind alleys, others were hugely successful, futuristic ideas that were way ahead of their time. They would become the frontrunners in developing many of today's weapon systems. German optics experts led the way out of the darkness with a groundbreaking new night sight called the Vampire. It would be the very first infrared sighting system used by individual soldiers.
Vampire night sight was a piece of infrared equipment. It broadcast a signal of infrared energy. It's invisible to the naked eye, but through that night sight, you could see in the dark. This is one of the very first night sights that was actually used in combat.
Today, the Vampire's descendants rule the global combat zone and are an essential part of any soldier's armory.
Nowadays, we see more and more footage coming out of the Middle East. You see every soldier having night vision sights on. That lineage goes back to the German heritage in the Second World War with the Vampire system, being able to own the night. If you do not own the night, you do not own the battlefield.
Many of the weapons designed for use by the Waffen SS form the template for the high-tech technologies that now boss today's battlefield. The Sturmgewehr, the MG42, the Vampire night sight. Their technological legacy is set in steel. The Waffen SS fought to the bitter end. They were the deadliest of enemies.
They did not want to give ground. They fought hard, they stayed, they held their lines. That produces the hardest fighters. Coupled with training and indoctrination, gives you the absolute elite.
As soldiers, they could very fairly be called elite troops. The problem with the SS, of course, is they're Nazis. They have this Nazi ideology, and remember, we won. We beat them, and deservedly so.
Drawn together, the branches on the Waffen SS family tree